audio precision measurement rigs, which are, people are going to yell at me for this, but they're fancy voltmeters.
Yeah, like putting a car in a dyno and then using that to explain how it handles. It's like, no.
Whether it's objectively correct or not, that's what I want. That's the kind of sound I'm going for.
But it was such a lacking amplifier. It had no dynamics, no life, no soul, just horrible.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. And today's episode's a bit different because today what I've done is pulled together a roundtable type conversation of 4 different audio reviewers, including myself. In a moment I'm going to show you video and audio of a conversation between Amos from Currawong, Cameron from Golden Sound, Brian from Wave Theory, and of course me. In this particular video, we started off talking about how each of us as reviewers use measurements to inform our reviews, inform our general decisions about products, whether we use them, whether we don't, what we like, what we don't, etc. And then we kind of go off from there into what I think are some interesting topics. Our plan is to make these a semi-regular thing, maybe monthly or thereabouts. And what we'll be doing is rotating the hosting of these and therefore the posting of these through the 4 of us and possibly bringing others in as well. And so first and foremost, I do want to encourage you to go and subscribe to each of the channels that are featured here in this video. And I'll put links down below in the description so you can quickly and easily jump through to those channels. 3 other things I want to mention briefly is that the audio quality isn't the best for this. We have done our best to maximize sound, but as always is the case, the first time you do something like this, you sometimes learn a few things about it. I'll certainly be improving my microphone for next time. The other 2 things I want to mention is that we had a bit of a glitch with the recording software. We think Brian's laptop may have run out of hard drive space. So unfortunately, Brian does drop out towards the end and there was no way to recover his footage, both video or audio. The final thing I want to mention by way of introduction to the video you're about to see is that I want to explain why I brought the 4 of us together. In the comments section on my videos, and indeed on other people's videos and around the internet in general, I'm often struck by how much black and white thinking there is in this hobby. As much as I'm a reviewer, I'm also a consumer and enjoyer of audio products like you are, and so I also watch reviews from other reviewers. And these 3 that I've invited to come and be a part of this roundtable are 3 reviewers that I find myself going to because I find they deliver the information in a balanced way. And so let me hand over now to the footage as we discuss, as a starting point at least, how each of us use measurements in our audio reviews.
All right, so we're talking, just had to get my head in gear there. We're talking about measurements, how we use measurements, how we don't use measurements, etc. Or I should say how we do and don't use measurements. So let's maybe kick off with getting a sense from each of you around how you use measurements for the reviews that you produce. So whether it's electronic devices like a DAC or a headphone amp, or headphones, IEMs, etc. How do you go about using measurements? And we'll go alphabetically here. So Amos, do you want to kick us off? How do you use measurements? Do you use measurements, and what sorts of devices do you use them for?
I don't particularly use measurements for. I mean, if there's some particular thing I want to highlight in a review that's relevant to, mainly use like headphones and that kind of thing, like especially comparing headphones, then measurements can be helpful. Or if there's a particular, like especially with electronics, if I hear a particular thing, or I think there was like those SMSL amps which had these settings to kind of change the sound, and I think was it you, Cameron? I think you might have measured someone measured them.
Yeah, sent some stuff over for you.
It was the SMSL stuff, and you can measure, yes, it adds a bit of even order harmonic distortion or third order or something like that. It's like, okay, that can highlight that. But that's kind of as far as I go because there's too much of a quagmire to go, super deep into stuff because the deeper you go, the more you really have to know to not be actually misled or confused by it.
Does it inform your decisions on what you think is good or bad?
Not at all. I mean, kind of good and bad are very relative. I mean, it's kind of... That's an issue I kind of have with, discussion of measurements in the hobby is like people are saying, okay, there's a good and a bad, but there's no standard for good and bad. And it's really relative. I mean, if you enjoy a particular, we're in this hobby for enjoyment and then kind of judging, it seems to be a common theme that people will judge other people's, stuff on that's stupidly expensive or that's whatever. It could be a price judgment and it could be a judgment around measurements or that kind of thing. And that's, that's the kind of the negatives in the thing. So I don't really consider it kind of good or bad unless it's something showing, well, I would say talking about a product, but I don't want to mention, which the stated maximum power output was actually measured to be way lower than what had been stated by the manufacturer, and that's an issue. So unless it shows up something that's a real issue, real problem, like which could be, let's say, damaged headphones or something like that, then it's really, the rest of it's kind of subjective.
Yeah, I think
there's
that's a really
people
interesting point.
who they try and use measurements as an absolute ranking or explanation as to which product is definitively better than another, rather than trying to use them as a descriptor of how it sounds and therefore how it's going to play into someone's preference. The existence of measurements doesn't change the fact that preference exists, right? People like different things. Audio isn't solved. We don't all have the exact same gear. Why is it that people are trying to effectively pretend that that's not the case when we can be using measurements as another tool to try and help find products which actually you might like? You might be able to look at a set of measurements and go, I know I'm not going to like that because it's got loads of second order harmonics, so it's probably going to be kind of warm. But I've got a friend who likes that kind of stuff, so maybe I'll recommend it to him. It should be a descriptor, not a ranking system.
So what about for you, Cameron? How do you use the measurements? Because you obviously do a lot of measurements for your channel. Do those measurements inform your decisions about the product, or again, it's more just a description of the product for you? So I always listen before I measure. I make sure to spend some proper time with things listening before I do any measurements, because I don't want what I see on the graphs or behavior or anything like that to influence what I might hear. Because that's another thing is, if you look at a set of measurements for a product and then go and listen to it, it will influence what you hear. No one is immune to placebo or expectation bias. It doesn't matter who you are. So I wouldn't say that I use them as something I would say, I'm going to buy that product because it measures this kind of way. There are enough products which measure exceptionally in all sorts of different categories. Now that, if that's all you're looking for, there are plenty of options for you. The best sounding products that I've heard for my tastes, for my preference, have been some of the best measuring ones, but the ones that measure the best aren't always the ones that I think sound the best. So, for example, I've been pretty open about the fact that I wasn't super keen on a lot of the topping products, for example. They measure exceptionally in a lot of different ways, but I found them to be quite clinical in many areas. Whereas something like the Holodacks, for example, they've got some really quite exceptional measured characteristics, and I really like the way that they sound. It's not necessarily that one is a prerequisite for the other. And there's been certain products like the shit Yggdrasil, for example, which doesn't measure very well. And I really liked it, but with products like that, what's been kind of interesting is that they never sounded really neutral to me. They never sounded correct. All the ones that did measure weirdly, but I still enjoyed, I enjoyed for reasons other than the fact that they were neutral, because they weren't. The shit Yggdrasil is not a neutral sounding DAC, but it's... Yeah, it's a good point. That's it.
It's that, sometimes you don't want that. I was the other day I was using the APX 555, feeding it as a DAC into a tube amp, which is probably the most contradictory thing you could do in audio. But yeah, measurements aren't a prerequisite for buying a product for me. As said, they are kind of a descriptor for how something might sound. I think we've got a pretty decent understanding of how a lot of different factors play into what we hear. We do not have sufficient understanding to predict exactly how something will sound from the measurements, and it shouldn't be taken like that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think a really good case in point, I've been playing around lately. I had the Topping NX7, that little portable amplifier I had here for review, and I've just received the G5, which is the same deal basically, but with the Bluetooth and USB built-in DAC. And both of those, I'm guessing, I don't even bother with the measurements on those sorts of products these days, because I know that if it's topping, it's going to be designed to measure well. So I'm assuming and pretty confident that it does measure really well, and they sound great. I think they're a fantastic little device, both of them. But then I'll turn around and listen to another topping amplifier that also measures really well and don't enjoy it at all. So I think that's what you were just saying is really accurate, Cameron, from my experience as well, that just because it measures well, one thing can sound fantastic and measure well, one thing can sound really bland and dull. The old SMSL SP200, I think, was an example of that, where it measured great, but it was such a lacking amplifier. It had no dynamics, no life, no soul, just horrible. The treble on the SP200 was brutal. It was really harsh, really sharp.
It's kind of that same vein as the THX 789, I think. But a lot of it also, I mean, I mentioned this in my Why You Can't Trust Measurements video, but it really does depend on what you're measuring as well. Because a lot of the time, the measurements that you see online of a product aren't complete. Yeah. And a good example is the Rebel amp and the THX 789. Both of which have quite strong sort of reputations. A lot of people saying that, the THX 789 was very sterile and clinical. Some people really like it, and that's fine. And then there was the Rebel amp, which had a reputation for being exceptionally warm and kind of dense and thick sounding. They both have almost identical Synad. It was both, almost, I think it was 115 or something. And if you just took it like that, you go, oh, well, that's audibly transparent. It's above 100 dB or whatever, so therefore they must sound the same. But they really don't. And it's not that there aren't measurements to explain that. If you look deeper, there are things that are very different about the two. But you can't use what is inherently a very limited measurement to describe the entire sound profile of a device. It doesn't work that way.
And I think
putting
that's
a car
been
in
a
a
big challenge.
dyno, and like putting a car in a dyno and then using that to explain how it handles. It's like, no.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody does slew rate measurements on amps. It's like, no, that's one of the critical things you should do. And there was some discussion actually with the manufacturer about that, which we'll have to look into a bit more. But one of the interesting things actually that THX 789 is I got it was on one of my videos. I got a couple of little devices you attach to the DC input of an amp, and one of them was a capacitor bank, which gives you kind of a bit of a buffer, and the second was a filter setup that you actually have inside, say, a typical topping amp, and which is a couple of capacitors, a couple of chokes, and some other stuff I forgot. But
was it the noise nuke by any chance?
No. It's some Japanese thing, which is a little tiny board with a little DC connector on it, and you can actually hook the boards together. They've got a new version, and I've got a couple of sets of those, and I use them on stuff. So if you add, say, to the THX 789, or actually the Cavalli Tube Hybrid, if you add the capacitor bank with the 789, you get more bass, and noticeably, it's like whoa. And then with the Cavalli Tube Hybrid, it's like upgrading your amp. You get more dynamics. And then if you add behind that, you add the filter, the noise filter, then the dynamics are muted somewhat and it becomes kind of clearer, but kind of like a bit more muted. And I hear that like a little bit if you look inside, like I've got the topping A90D now, and I've looked inside that, you can see kind of, it's got two $10 switching power supplies in there, which are apparently pretty decent switching power supplies. I mean, they're Meanwell power supplies. And then it's got the same kind of setup. It's got a couple of capacitors and a couple of chokes in there because switching power supplies output heaps of high frequency noise because they're switching power supplies. It's kind of like DSD. They use the same kind of, they use a pulse wave modulation. But anyway, they have to filter out the really high frequency noise, otherwise it can damage equipment. But yeah, those chokes are going to choke the sound literally. Although not all chokes do that, but in power filters they do. So I think that's where some of it comes from, is that literally that SP200 was just literally basically a switching power supply and then a THX amp. So that's why it kind of sounded so dead. I think they probably get away with it with the A90D because it has such a high power output. Obviously, it's because it makes the Synad look better because 8 watts is going to be output is going to be way higher than the noise floor of the electronics. But still, it doesn't quite have the dynamics of a better amp, like a high-end
I haven't
amp.
done the review of that one yet, but I've done my listening to it up against the Singer SA1, and for me it's no contest between the two as to which one I would want to listen to. The A90D is fine, but if you said to me, plug your headphone into one of these two amps, I'm not going to sit there going, which one? It's just going to go click SA1 off we go.
Yeah, indeed, the same thing.
I've been promised an A90D, but it hasn't arrived yet. So hopefully soon. Yeah.
It's worth a play. It's a lovely. I love the design. I love the interface and the design and the general interactions with it. Its sound is just a little bit lacking in that sort of soul and presence for me.
The original A90 I thought was just another one of those hype train deals. It was similar to what you described between the Singer SA1 and the A90D. Like there's a clear one you would rather listen to. I did not enjoy the A90. Like I have the Lake People G111 that I keep around as like my kind of mid-fi reference amp. And honestly, like I said in my G111 review, I think when you buy the A90, the G111 is the amp you think you're getting, right? Like that's just how it comes across to me. Anyway, now to the original question that started off, like how do I use measurements?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to you on that one.
Yeah, for DACs and amps and that sort of thing, I really don't. And I always listen first. Before I go looking for any measurements. And then, of course, the toppings and much of the SMSLs of the world and all that, they're going to measure beautifully, at least according to an audio precision measurement rig, right? Like that's what they're designed to do. But what I will do after I listen for a while is go look up a headphone frequency response measurement. Like that's one thing that I do find interesting. And usually if I do that, it's because I'm looking for something. I think Amos said that about like if he does measurements, he's usually looking for something. right? And like I'll look and say, okay, this sounds like I have a real problem with shoutiness and honkiness in headphones. Like that, just my ears pick that up annoyingly fast. Let's go with that. And so I will go and start looking at, all right, what's the tonal balance through the mids? What is causing that to trip my ear up on that? And like, you know, it could be a 1K peak where everything else is lower than that, like even compensating for the ear gain and all of that. Or it could be, you know, the second harmonic of 1K, which is 3K. That's a common one too, where you get a peak there and that's higher than everything else. Again, even compensating for ear gain. And it's like, oh, there it is. That's why I'm hearing shoutiness and honkiness and that sort of thing. But always listen first. That's what I do, yes. Which sounds like that's basically what the four of us do, is we're like, well, ears first, measurements second.
Yeah, that definitely aligns with me as well. So I'm very much, I don't care about measurements of DACs and amps and stuff like that. I'll have a look at them sometimes out of pure interest, but I don't care about that at all. If it sounds good, that's all that matters to me. You know, I've got a shit Folkvanger on my desk. That's
nice. Measurements aren't a substitute for listening. They really
absolutely, exactly. And
I'll tell you what's really interesting though is when something which is like objectively not ideal might be something which is subjectively preferable. And I was going to mention sort of as part of the previous thing. So like obviously I post measurements and stuff, and I try to keep the commentary on them as minimal as possible, purely because I don't want, I don't want to influence other people when they go and try it, because the measurements aren't a full picture of how something sounds. It might give you some hints, but it's not you can't fully understand it. But sometimes there's something which you notice a trend in, and again, this is where you can start using measurements as a bit of an interesting descriptor for how something might sound. And it's more interesting when it's something which is technically bad. So like the second order harmonics is probably the most talked about one. Makes things sound warm even if the frequency response is completely flat. But one thing I noticed on a couple devices, like two DACs, for example, the Shit Yggdrasil and the Rockner Wave Dream, both of them subjectively have a reputation for being quite slammy, very sort of dynamic sounding. And something that they have in common is that the distortion changes depending on level. As you go up in level, it suddenly drops quite a bit. I can't get a screenshot up, but if I show like that, that is the synod versus output level. And so it kind of stands to reason that as you have a big macrodynamic swing or something, that change in distortion could have quite an audible impact. And maybe that's something which is making things sound more dynamic, more punchy, more slammy. And so maybe that's something which, if that's the kind of sound you like, that's what you should be looking for. So you should be able to look at a set of measurements like the Yggdrasil. That was the Wave Dream, not the Yggdrasil, but the Yggdrasil has something very similar, and go, so that I think that's going to sound slammy because it's got that sort of characteristic. I think that it's going to sound warm because it's got that. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Whether it's objectively correct or not, that's what I want. That's the kind of sound I'm going for. So why shouldn't I use this information to my advantage? There's so many people who, they've tried some of the objectively excellent stuff and didn't like it, and therefore have chosen to effectively just completely write off measurements, sometimes quite aggressively. When actually that's kind of throwing away what could be quite a useful resource, something which is only going to get more useful over time as more measurements are available and we develop a better understanding of how to interpret them. But yeah, I think ideally more people would treat them with it. Well, how I view it is, they're not the only answer. They're not a substitute for listening. You can't tell how something is going to sound in its entirety from measurements, but you can get some pretty big hints, and you can get a fairly good understanding of whether you're likely to enjoy it or not, and to describe certain factors. And so that's useful.
Yeah, I completely agree with the idea of, for me, they're a comparative tool. They're a tool that you can use to say, I know that this is my preference, and therefore, if this has more of that or less of that, it's going to tell me what to expect. My thinking there was along the lines of the fact that we've got this assumption that what's on the page will tell us how something sounds without actually having the baseline of what we're hearing in the first place. And a case in point, I'm doing a video at the moment where there's some great research around the filtering and the resonance characteristics of the ear canals, depending on the length, the shape, how much it compresses, etc., completely changes the frequency response of the ear canal. So instantly, how I hear a pair of headphones or earphones is completely different to the three of you. It's definitively provable. and yet we could both be looking at the exact same frequency response and come to a conclusion that it's going to sound like X, but that's never going to take into account the fact that your ear canal is going to boost 3 kilohertz, mine's going to be boosting 6 kilohertz. We're going to hear something different in the end. And that's where, for me, it's very much that comparative thing of, I know that I like earphone X. If I can then look at a measurement of earphone Y that's been measured on the same exact rig with the same settings, then I can look at it and go, that one's got less of this or more of this. I'm going to like it or I'm not going to like it. So, yeah, I think what you just said, Cameron, is a really great point around it's about building that knowledge and that understanding of all the measurements that we have and how they interact with one another and what it tells us by comparison rather than in isolation, for sure. Amos, you were going to chuck something in there?
Yeah, probably a whole lot now you've mentioned it. Well, actually, there was one site where people designed their own kind of compensation curve around their measurements for kind of that reason, because it sounded more like what they were perceiving from headphones. But that's where, like, I just thinking, because I find it funny, of course, you guys are all wearing fancy headphones and I'm wearing AirPods. But it's like you got also, God, we're all such bad audiophiles here. But anyway, we're doing Zoom.
For the next episode, we've got to wear the craziest set that you've got. Just wear RAL or 1266 or something stupid.
Yeah,
with the 12, that would be brilliant. But yeah,
I've got those high volume R10Ds that stick way out there. Those are hilarious.
Here you go.
Anyway,
I've got right
keep
here.
going. Oh wow!
What on? We've gotten a bit derailed. But
you
sorry.
saved those Zoom calls, I can tell.
Yeah.
Will I get kicked out if I just wear like Pizza Pros? Is that allowed? Or?
Yeah,
we might get some good comments, that's for sure.
Yeah, but thinking of the expansive stuff like that, because I was talking to Dan, and I mean some of these amateur measurements did like show, like, I mean, I don't know why not more people don't do CSDs, because they show, and that's going to another direction with measurements being like a snapshot. Measurements don't really show stuff over time, and I think Cameron, you started pointing out stuff related to this, but a lot of the focus on developing better headphones, and especially with people like Dan Clark, was because he's showing CSDs and showing that there were ringing and resonances in headphones. That I mean, that's a showing you some stuff that's happening over time. That stuff is resonating. And I remember Grado, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce their name. There was a case of the tape mod, and I don't know if you heard of this. It was a few years back. And what people would do is they found that the ear pads, the standard L cushion, was actually resonated. I think it was 2 kilohertz or somewhere around that, because of its size. And what happens if you put tape around the ear pads, it would actually damp that resonance, and you get that less of that exciting 2 kilohertz resonance, because the thing about Grados is they have that exciting mid-range, and it was actually all resonance. So, and I was looking at a pair, I was doing the Expanse video and looking at the CSD someone had done of the Susvaras, and they do have I think it was about 2 kilohertz resonance, and that can make them sound very exciting. And discussion with someone else about measurements and that kind of thing. I mean, some headphones do have that left in. I mean, not any high-end ones, but I think it was some low mid-range ones. And it gives that kind of exciting sound, and some people like that. So it was that kind of discussion between, technically it's kind of a bad thing. Hey, it's a resonance, it's a distortion. But on the other hand, it's, people enjoy that. So I think it's good that when you mentioned about, having DACs that sound like they have slam, having, the noise floor going up and down with the increased thing. I think that's a really very relevant thing. It's like being able to connect, hey, okay, they have this effect in it. You can see this in when you measure it, or you see the performances, over time, which I think should be done more often, like an oscilloscope. Some people should do videos of what happens in an oscilloscope when you put different signals through, which is I'd love to do, but if you see stuff happening over time, you say, okay, this is what you're perceiving when you feel that this has slam or has this particular effect to the sound or whatever. That would be way more relevant than talking about, hey, this just has low THD. I mean, harmonic distortion is not anything unpleasant anyway. I mean, it's added to music, and music itself is harmonic distortion. So, in a way, people are kind of arguing against stuff which people enjoy. So you have to kind of say, okay, how are you going to, and, think how to, in terms of measurements and performance and stuff like that, when talking about it in a review, it's sort of like, well, it comes down, some people are going to enjoy this and some people are not, and kind of explaining, it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just, people have different preferences, and but I mean but that particular thing you mentioned about, headphones, I think it's fun that, stuff like the Expanse did come about, and all the, the AMTS and all that came about from all those way back those CSD measurements that people made, which showed, hey, look, you have these resonances in there, and discussion of how they actually affected, what we're actually hearing when we were listening.
I think that's a really interesting segue perhaps into one of the questions that we'd thought about talking about today, which was, are there measurements that you wish were available that aren't? Is there something that you hear, that you notice in earphones, headphones, DACs, amps, where there is no obvious measurement for it that you'd love to be able to actually get a handle on? So I'll give you an example from my perspective. I do tend to prioritize soundstage quality. It doesn't necessarily have to be a huge soundstage, but the quality, the shape, and the focus and separation of the sounds within the soundstage.
Yeah, that was going to be mine.
Right up there.
Yep.
Okay.
Spatial performance. Yep.
Okay. And I know there are some things that we can measure that give us some indication of that, but that's something for me where I would love to see a measurement that could absolutely lock that down to a point where I could look at measurements and say headphone X, headphone Y, or amp X, amp Y. This one is going to have the better soundstage than that one. And as far as I'm aware, there's no individual measurement or even a clearly defined set of 2 or 3 measurements that absolutely defines that. So, Brian, you said it would be the same for you. Cameron, is there a measurement that kind of you wish you could get clear on?
I don't necessarily think that there's a particular measurement that we sort of are missing. I think it's an issue of interpretation, because our ability to measure stuff is great. We've got some absolutely amazing tools nowadays, both for sort of acoustic measurements of headphones and speakers, and electronic measurements of DACs and amplifiers and that kind of thing. The problem is, how do you go from that set of 20 to 50 different graphs and charts and numbers to how big is the soundstage, or what shape is the soundstage? How good is the imaging? Is it precise? Is the all this kind of subjective stuff, which you can't put a number to, you can't put on a graph, because it's it's how our hearing system and our brain is interpreting a lot of different things at once. But okay, so I can't say too much about it just now, but I actually have a video coming, which so a company who I'm trying to figure out how much I can say, specializes in spatial audio related stuff, has some quite interesting projects and research coming. So hopefully should have some more about that soon.
Cool.
There's a big problem is that there's a lot of research which is actually kind of proprietary. Companies have done this kind of stuff for any particular application, often not consumer audio related, but they don't want to just give it away. It's great that things like, Harman research and stuff is publicly available for the most part, but there's a huge financial incentive for a lot of different companies to keep certain things to themselves. And so if I were to have a sort of wish list, it would basically be that more information that is actually out there, more understanding of how to interpret the data which we can gather, was available to the public. That would be ideal. I don't think we're in quite a good state compared to some other industries, but there is some cool stuff which isn't in the public eye.
Yeah. What about you, Amos?
I think there are a couple of well, I can give one thing away with Soundstage, and that is, if you look at way back, there used to be a site called Anything But iPod, and it was over 10 years ago now. And I don't know what happened to the guy who ran it, but he had some interesting stuff to say. And one of the things he pointed out is like the perception of soundstage with electronics. If you look at the crosstalk measurements, you'll see, some of them will be like, okay, you have like the bass goes down and the treble goes up. And that's, we know if we do that with EQ, if we pull the mids back, it feels like there's more soundstage. So some amp manufacturers do tweak the crosstalk in that way to give you a sense of soundstage. And we know that because way back, Audio GD used to have these little discrete op amps, much like, what are they called?
Burson or Sparkos?
Burson, that's it, yeah. Those things. But, and he had 3. It was called the Earth, Sun, and Moon, but it doesn't matter. The Earth was like dead neutral.
Right.
Yeah, and then the Sun had some weird setup, but the Moon had this V-shaped crosstalk, and it distinctly had that kind of greater soundstage effect. And so you do get, people don't talk about the crosstalk measurements. I mean, we saw with Yggdrasil, actually, I asked Jason about this. If you see their crosstalk measurement, it has this weird bump in the mid bass. It's a bit skew because of the way he said it was something to do with the DC servo. But anyway, if you compare like AB and Yggdrasil to say Hugo 2 or Q-Test or something like that, then you'll notice that slight boost in the mid bass, depending on what music you're listening to. And that was from the crosstalk. So you can get effects like, people say, oh, but how can something be warm or cold? And they're knowing which measurements, and that's one of the ones to add to the kind of soundstage thing. But I think the other problem is to do with timing, and how we perceive distance and all that kind of thing has to do with timing. And there's some talk about this, obviously, and if you talk to Rob Watson of Chord. But I think maybe, like I think Cameron said, the companies that are actually dealing with this, the closest we come is spatial audio. Spatial audio companies that make 3D plugins and that kind of thing, which give you, and now of course, these being very relevant, and how you perceive, space around you. And interesting, I was having a conversation with someone actually about the AirPods and the fact that the transparency mode. Now, if you years way back when I was a child of all things, do you like Lachlan? Do you remember there was a TV show called Towards 2000 and Beyond 2000 on TV?
I do, yeah.
I remember that. Oh, I love watching that.
Very Aussie show for those that are not in Australia.
Yeah, so I remember they showed like advanced technology and stuff like that, which now would be like nothing particularly special. But I mean, it showed interesting science before we had things like we could see it online, obviously. And I remember I think it was that show. They did a thing where they showed, okay, they put a person in a chair and blindfolded them, and they said, okay, they're going to play sounds, and you got to point where the sounds are. So they played a sound over there from the speaker, and they pointed to that and all that kind of thing. And then what they did is they put a mold over their ears, which completely covered their ears except for a hole going through the center, and then asked them to do the same thing. And of course, it killed, because the reflections of the sound off our ears determine where sound comes from, right? And they couldn't determine with that all blocked off. So the interesting thing was, and I never realized this because it was so good, in transparency mode. Now, if you put earphones in your ears, it's going to kill your spatial location ability, right? If I put these in transparency mode and someone's talking to me over there, I can tell it's coming from over there. And then this person I was talking to pointed this out to me, and they were talking about actually a company that deals with measuring spatial audio and kind of stuff like that too. So it's, and it was like, what? And I just realized that how good these are. Because, the gold standard for spatial audio is like nothing in your ears. And these do spatial, you can hear where sounds are coming from in transparency mode. I'm like, what? And it was so clear, automatic, that I hadn't even noticed. And so there's definitely
Do we know how
a lot.
they're doing that? Is there some external way that it's capturing what's bouncing off the pinner, or is
absolutely.
It, do you know?
So I don't know how I've got another pair here. I know if I pull them out, probably it's going to screw up the audio on my computer. But you can, if you look on the AirPods, and maybe you can see there's
the
a
little
black
vent thing.
Yeah, they're all microphones, and they're definitely picking up where sound is coming from around you. And then, because they have the gyro and everything in there, they can actually tell. You actually do hear as if you've got not quite nothing in your ears, as if you've got a slight small earplug in your ear.
That's pretty cool.
Almost sounds like it's kind of like on-the-fly binaural recording, almost. The way you're describing it, with a microphone at the ear like that, catching the reflections off the pinna and all, all of that. Like that's what it made me think of. It's like a real-time binaural recording, just play it back.
Oh, absolutely. It's in real time, because I went downstairs and talked to my wife, and I was moving around and everything like that, and I could hear perfectly clearly, as if it feels, again, you still feel like you've got something in your ears, and it's slightly damping the sound. But I've got them in transparency mode now, and I can hear the reflection, how the sound's reflecting off stuff around me. Not perfectly, but when I went down there, I realized these are amazing. Like, truly amazing, and they don't make a huge deal about it. But the transparency mode is close to transparent in terms of even space, and it's absolutely remarkable. So there's definitely, and as like Cameron said, there's definitely a huge understanding there of this stuff. But again, it's all proprietary and all. And the interesting thing was, if you try and measure these know that you've got them in an ear or in a measuring rig. They know, apparently. So you can't. They can tell if you're in an ear. And the interesting thing, when I fiddle around with them, because they don't sit perfectly, they beep. Very slight tones come out. So I think they're checking to see if they're in an ear or not. So there's some really crazy technology in there. And we don't even know the fraction of it.
They're probably just detecting if there's another EM field nearby, because a microphone is just like, it's a speaker driver in reverse, right? Like, there's a magnet in there and a wire coil, so it puts out a magnetic field. Probably that's what they're sensing. Like, oh, there's another little EM field that looks like a microphone nearby. That
could well be.
That's probably what it's doing. Yeah.
Or are
There's
they
a
doing
lot of-
otoacoustic measurements and actually working out, because you can
Could
use
be. Yeah.
you can use what comes back out of the ear canal to work
Right.
out how to adjust the frequency response. So it could be doing that intelligently as well. Although I think they would have made a big deal about that if that was actually what was going on.
So
Yeah.
space and reproduction of space is always going to be tricky because like the brain does so much work with localizing sounds. And like as Amos said, like you've got, time delays and the subtle pitch change. Like if a sound is off to my right, it reaches my right ear first and then my left ear second. And then there's that slight, like usually decrease in pitch, as it gets to my left ear and all that. And that helps with the localization. And I think a lot of the research we're talking about here has just done a lot of trial and error in testing of like, well, what does this result sound like to a person listening? Because we really don't understand all of this yet and like what's going on here. Because in real life, like you take earbuds out or, headphones off or even speakers and all that. If someone loses hearing in one ear, for a while, they take a huge hit on their ability to localize sound. But then their brain will eventually compensate and they will begin to localize sound again, usually much better on the half that they can hear, but they regain the bulk of their ability to do sound localization again. We don't know how or why that happens. Okay, but it does happen. Go ahead.
There's some blind people who've trained themselves to be able to echolocate. Like, not a joke, genuinely.
That's right. I've heard of that. Yeah.
I'm sure it's not a particularly common thing, but that just kind of goes to show how amazing the human auditory system can be. I mean, that I'm sure is a huge amount of training.
Right. And so like there's going to be an inherent limitation in our ability to use electronic measurements and even like, putting a headphone on a pair of microphones and doing frequency sweeps and like all of that kind of like just that way of measuring things. There's going to be limitations in terms of how well we can predict something like spatial recreation because of that. Like, and again, let's remember that brains and microphones and audio precision measurement rigs, which are, people are going to yell at me for this, but they're fancy voltmeters. Okay. Like that's what they are. Like those are each fundamentally different ways of measuring and perceiving things. Like our brains are not looking for variations in voltage. Okay. They are looking for patterns. Like our brains are pattern recognition and analysis machines. And that's like what they're picking up on. And they are very, very good at picking out patterns and picking out subtle changes in patterns, which again it is an inherently different nature. It is a different way of measuring and observing things than an electronic measurement box. So they are going to be capable of doing different things that our technology has yet to replicate.
And I think part of the challenge there is the number of factors. So I don't know that I entirely agree with the fact that the measurement devices won't be able to replicate it. I think it's more that they'll have to replicate it in a piecemeal function, and then the interpretation, and this goes back to your point before, I think, Cameron, the interpretation to bring all of those piecemeal measurements back together. So what you were saying, Brian, is accurate, that our brain is doing so much to capture all of this data that's going on and instantaneously make it mean something that's relevant to us, whereas the dumb measurement devices are really all they're going to be doing is basically saying the timing of this is this, the frequency response of this is this, whatever it might be, and then it's about how do we process that data and understand it in the same way our brains does. And this is actually, this conversation we just had over the last few minutes has raised two really interesting points. We might not have time to get to both of them, but I wanted to kind of throw them on the table and see where it takes us. One of them is the fact that I've just finished reading a book called The Sound Mind, and it's about our auditory processing system. And specifically what it talks about is that we all have differing levels of ability depending on our history, our upbringing. Growing up in a noisy environment versus a not noisy environment can change the way our auditory mind is arranged, whether we played a musical instrument, strangely enough, our involvement in athletics. All these things alter our sound mind. And one of the things that came to me out of this and how it ties back to what we were just saying, the sound mind is constantly or the auditory brain, I should say, is constantly looking at things like the frequency response that we're hearing. So things like in speech, for instance, the sweeps in tonality can be different depending on the languages that you speak, and it can help us understand speech. But therefore, that also carries over to our acuity, to what we're hearing from, say, a pair of headphones or speakers around frequency response. But then there's also the timing response differences as well, and phase and things like that. What it really raised for me was the fact that we're all different as well. And so you've probably had the same thing with commenters on your YouTube channels. You might say that I've listened to product X and product Y, and there's the difference of X%. And I try to avoid percentages, but for the sake of this analogy, let's say there's a 10% difference. Somebody else might come in and say, it's much bigger than that, or it's much smaller than that. What are you talking about? And I get the sense that it all comes down to the fact that we actually all have different hearing abilities. And I don't mean that from an elitist golden ears point of view. What I mean is that literally your experience, the amount of practice you've done either as a critical listener and or as a musician, alters what you're going to be hearing coming out of a headphone or a pair of speakers. For anyone watching this, if you're seeing a blank space and hearing no sound, Brian was having a fantastic conversation with us. You'll just have to fill in the gaps and pretend for yourself. So yeah, Brian, I just finished talking about the idea that the brain, we all hear differently. So we've all got different hearing abilities, not because of any God-gifted or naturally endowed skill, but so much as the experiences we've had growing up and playing instruments, doing sport, being in noise, being not in noise, etc. And the brain is so plastic as well, in the sense that it is constantly evolving and changing. So it's also not to say that your current learning ability is your forever learning ability, not learning, so hearing ability. That can change. If you start playing an instrument, a musical instrument today, you're going to improve your listening ability because you're focused on that area of development. I
was going to jump in and just say, because obviously earlier you're talking about how different people have not necessarily different hearing abilities. Well, obviously that is the case, but also just different hearing, period. You know, different HRTS, different actual, effectively, the frequency response of your own hearing alone is going to be different to the person sitting next to you. But there's also things which just for one person might change throughout the day. There's been times when I've listened to, just my main setup, the one that I'm very familiar with and know very well. And I go, this sounds brighter than usual or something. And it's not because the gears actually changed or because the headphones are suddenly any different, but just because I was hungry or tired or angry or something like that. The state that you are in at that time can also play a huge effect on both how you perceive something and how well you can actually look into certain aspects of the sound. So that's another thing, which is if you're comparing things not side by side, that's something which is always important to keep in mind, is that your own hearing is not fixed. It will change slightly or a lot depending on a lot of different factors about the environment and you, your mood, your body, everything. So one person's own hearing is not fixed, let alone compared to multiple people.
That's a really good point, and it's interesting because both of the references I've mentioned today, the SoundMind book and also that article that measured the ear canal frequency response, both of those explain, now that you mention it, both of those kind of give some explanations for that. One of them is that obviously if the brain is such a big part of how we're perceiving audio, which we know it to be, then the state of your brain at the time, in terms of if you're stressed, if you've got a lot going on in your head, that can cause a level of sensory overload. It could cause you to be sensitive to certain sounds or types of sounds more than you normally would be. And then on top of that, in the ear canal response article, one of the measurements they looked at, which I didn't dive into in the video I'm producing, but they talked about the fact that even the tension of the eardrum, so they measure it as eardrum impedance, that can alter. So there's inside the ear, there's the three little bones that connect the eardrum into the inner ear. There is a muscle that's in there to help protect us from noise damage. So when you speak, for instance, that muscle gets tight and it damps, I should say, the response of your eardrum, so you don't actually make yourself deaf with your own voice.
For anyone watching, look up the subreddit Ear Rumblers Assemble.
Okay. That sounds like a can of worms or a rabbit hole to go down. I'm looking forward to that. So the simple fact of your physical state at the time, stress levels, tension, tiredness, etc., would absolutely be affecting that reflex and how your ears are going to respond to the sound, and therefore the frequency response that you're hearing through that eardrum. So yeah, it's really interesting, all the pieces that start to come together.
It is worth mentioning, actually. Okay, so that was meant to be just a quiet reference, but actually, basically, some people are able to control that muscle manually, and when you tighten it a lot, it basically makes a sort of rumbling sound. There's actually some people who've used like in-ear mics to actually record that sound as well. But yeah, it affects how you hear things in quite an interesting way.
I've had that. That's like a strange rumble sometimes from that.
Yeah, like when you yawn and stuff is quite common.
Okay.
I don't know what percentage of people can do it. I thought it was something which everyone can do. Apparently not, but it's interesting. There's a subreddit called Ear Rumblers Assemble. It's just people talking about that.
You're going to link that. That's interesting. But there's also, just reminded me of there's another rabbit hole of where, there's research on like people's, voice pitch and language and, like because I live in Japan and the way people speak when they react to stuff is different to, maybe like an Aussie would, Aussies are like, oh, that's good. And where the Japanese are like, oh, that's amazing. If they don't show, high pitched enthusiasm, then they think it's crap. It was a totally cultural thing too. And there's also stuff. I wonder. I wonder if it's related to the fact that headphones here tended to be tuned differently with higher frequencies, less bass and that. That's
interesting.
And I wondered if that was kind of related. But that was interesting. The discussion about how experiences, whether you've learned an instrument or done certain things affect your hearing. Because, you hear those people online say, I tried these two different things and I couldn't hear a difference. And other people go, I can hear a clear difference. And so I wonder if some of that is related to the fact that, different people can pick up, some people go, well, if you can't hear a difference, great, you saved a lot of money. But those people, then I know, the guys who will go like, I just tried two different USB cables and I could hear a clear difference. It's like, don't tell anyone that. But, I wonder if it's just the development, they say you talk about, development of one's hearing, but I wonder if that has a lot to do with, one's experiences and how one was, brought up again and all that. So that probably is.
That's 100% my understanding is that it's been really good because I've often wanted to understand why that is, why I'll sit here and review a product and say, this one's heats better than this one. And cables is a great example. I get into a lot of hot water with my cable reviews because I hear differences between cables and not always better. Often they're more expensive cable I don't like as much, but there's differences. And I've often thought, is it just me? Am I making something up? And I think there's two factors involved. I think there's always going to be that expectation. If you go into a listening test not expecting to hear a difference, you're not going to. Likewise, you can trick yourself in the other direction. If you go in expecting a difference, you're going to. And so you do have to manage for that first. But then I think second to that is the fact that your ability to hear is 100% determined based on this book I've just read. It's 100% determined by the practice that your ears and brain have had over the years. And I don't mean practice listening to cables or devices or whatever. I mean the practice in terms of, did you play an instrument? There's really strong data that they present that some things have no impact on your ability to hear. So listening to music will not change your ability to hear at a neurological level. I don't know if they've tested like hardcore critical listening like you would do as, say, a reviewer, but definitely what they do show is that athletic involvement can alter it in certain ways and in different ways, playing a musical instrument, whether it's drumming, whether it's violin, piano, they're all going to have their own different nuances, but all of those things absolutely do improve people's ability to differentiate things like sound in noise. So this is coming from an audiology point of view. So one of the things they're interested in is as people get older and they lose their hearing, it gets very hard to hear a conversation in noisy environments. And so one of the things they're looking at is the fact that if you've played musical instruments, you are going to be better at selecting the sound you want to hear out of a noisy background. And I think about that as if we correlate that back across to what we're doing listening to music through devices, our ability to hear exactly how well this sound is separated from that sound within the mix and the sound of the soundstage and the subtleties of the timbre and the frequency response, all of that's going to come down to the development of our auditory pathways over the years of our existence. So yeah, I think there's huge parts of that. It's not been explored from an audio listening point of view so much as it has from this speech intelligibility point of view, but I think it's a really interesting area.
There's also an interesting question about whether that has an effect on one or both or neither maybe, but probably at least one, of either your ability to hear some of those things or your preference in regards to them. So, for example, I've played drums since I was very young. I don't necessarily know that means that I can hear things that other people can't in relation to percussion or dynamics and that kind of thing. But it certainly had an impact on my preference. And so that's the thing, is even if it doesn't actually alter your ability to hear something, if you've played violin, it might not actually increase your ability to hear how accurate the timbre of a violin is, but it might affect your preference as to whether it sounds close to the real thing or not.
Yeah, definitely. I think it does too. I think I played violin and viola for many years in orchestras, and my preference for how I like orchestral music presented is absolutely informed by that. And I think it's also slightly inaccurate to what a lot of people would prefer, because mine's based on sitting inside the orchestra, not outside the orchestra. And so I look for more texture and more separation of the sounds because I was sitting in close to them and I could hear it spatially around me. Whereas somebody who's used to sitting in a fourth, fifth row of an auditorium, they're hearing more the orchestra as one massive sound. And it's not to say one's right or wrong, but my preferences absolutely were informed by that, I'm sure.
There's also
it's an
point, I
issue
think it comes back to the point about, measurements and absolutes, and that, a lot of people are looking for absolutes in, they want absolute kind of determinism. This is good, this is bad, but really, there's a threshold. There are threshold. It's not straightforward. It's not there are different levels of, perception. There are different levels of. We talk about good and bad, but even in that, there are different degrees of. We talk about this sounds better than that. The differences might be small or something, but it's not. There are no kind of absolutes in this. I think it's a very good point since we're talking about measurements to begin with, is that very factor. Like when in my reviews, I'll go, well, I think I can hear a slight difference here, but it's below the point at which I'd reliably say, I can take a blind test on it or something like that, or something was definitely clearer to me, but it's not really. People go, oh, they want me to say, oh, this product is better than that product. I say, but the differences are so small, I wouldn't really care about it. That kind of thing, or in this particular situation, the differences are so small that I wouldn't bother. And you only really notice in comparisons, if your brain is adapted to one pair of headphones, yeah, sure, this other pair may be audibly different, but, maybe that I wouldn't necessarily, if you own one pair, wouldn't bother with the other pair, that kind of thing, because there are different grades of, different. And I think that's kind of missed in, a lot of discussion, especially coming around to the measurements thing, is that, yeah, there are, it's not just a black or white, good or bad thing in many cases. And of course, being really up to the individual, whether that
preference.
Yep.
Yeah, totally.
And sometimes there is no one right answer. Like, there's a reason why you see a lot of people in this hobby who have 5 pairs of headphones. They don't have a best headphone. That depends on what mood they're in, what they're listening to at the time, what they have listened to recently.
Which amp they want to switch on.
Yeah, that's the thing. Preference is undeniable, and it does kind of boggle my mind a bit that a lot of people almost pretend that it doesn't exist. Even things like the Harman curve. So, Harman's research is brilliant. And Resolve from the Headphone Show, he did a podcast talking a lot about this recently. It's quite interesting how the Harman curve generally fits most people very, very well. That's the whole point of it, and it does an excellent job of that. But it's smooth to, I think, 1/2. And back to your earlier point about how our own ear, our own biology, our own HRTF will impact things at a very narrow degree, particularly up in the higher frequencies. We don't know for any given person what the ideal frequency response is going to be there. So you'll see a headphone with what might look like a slightly jagged frequency response in the treble, and people go, oh, that's not smooth, that's not good. But actually, that might fit you perfectly. That might fit. In fact, it's likely that your perfect frequency response is not completely smooth. It would be shocking if it was. Yeah. Just things like that. There is no one-size-fits-all answer.
Everyone has the thing that surprised me is everyone has a null in their hearing. It was between 8 to 10 kilohertz, I gather. I know I was just told this offhand, so I don't know the fine details. But so if you see the headphone graph and then you see this big sharp peak, and you'll see, why do they have that? But actually, that's to counter the fact that you kind of everyone has a kind of null. But if your null matches that peak perfectly, you're going to hear those headphones as much darker. And so the person I was talking to about it had in an office with people, and they had this same pair of headphones, and they compared their own impressions, and they measured where they knew that their null was different. So they talked about how one of them found these headphones dark and one of them found them brighter or too bright or something like that. So it was a really fascinating discussion there. And I mean, even these simple things like that, people just don't really realize about at all.
There's so much complexity to it all. And, there's biology, anatomy, preference, interactions and synergy between gear. There are so many factors to consider, aren't there? No, it was great to have everyone here. And hopefully we'll see what the feedback from this one is. And hopefully we can do it again. And I don't know if you heard this one, Brian, but I'd love to pose the question of the philosophy around the purity of audio. Are we messing with what the artist intended? I think you said, Cameron, and I love that starting point, or it might have been you, Amos, that starting point of should we be actually messing with the audio? Are we instantly messing with the audio the moment we plug in any pair of headphones? So maybe we'll have a follow-up on that one at a future time.
To anyone watching, subscribe to all 4 channels, because this podcast is going to be rotating where it's posted.
That is a great point, and I will mention that in the intro and outro for this one as well. But that's a really good point. So yeah, please do check out all the channels. I'll put links in the description down below for all 4 of our channels as well. You'll be on mine already for this one, but for all 3 of the other channels down below. So make sure you go subscribe.
Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning, I did have to cut off some of the footage there because we lost Brian's feed. And so I apologise that the end of that video may have seemed a little bit disjointed, and also that we lost some of Brian's content and there were only the 3 of us remaining. We'll get that all fixed for next time. I think we've got some great content in mind, some interesting topics to talk about that aren't just going to be technically focused. And next topic's going to be more about the philosophy of audio and whether or not there's a need to be true to the artist's intent, or whatever that might mean. And so I think there's some interesting conversation to be had. So do make sure you subscribe here to my channel, but also to Golden Sound, Karawong and Wave Theory. And keep an eye out for the next edition of this review Roundtable on one of our channels. And we actually haven't decided which one yet, which is why I'm saying make sure you subscribe to all of us. That's not a deliberate ploy to make you subscribe. We honestly haven't talked about it yet. As always, I hope you found this video interesting and useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.